Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, zombie politics. The Labor left calls for gags on MPs to be lifted. Jeff Kennett rejects claims he was soft on wharfies. And Martin Ferguson jeered in Parliament for praising Oprah Winfrey just a little bit too much. Our panel tonight, Stella, editor of The Daily Grind, Gillian Bradford, editor of ABC News Online, and in Melbourne, former Labor advisor and Wangle contributing editor Luke Walladge. A senior ALP senator has warned that Labor MPs are at risk of turning into zombie politicians who don't stand up for what they believe in. Senator Doug Cameron says long-standing restrictions placed on Labor MPs from voting against party decisions should be lifted. He believes such self-censorship has led Labor voters to drift towards the Greens.
Well, again, I can only speak for myself. It seems to be like having a political lobotomy. You know, your brain is just ripped apart. You can't think about things. You're not allowed to talk about things. And really, you know, we don't want zombie politicians. We want politicians that can get out there, stand up for the things that they think are important, represent the people that should be represented, be a strong voice for the underprivileged in this country. And that's what we need.
Today's Nielsen poll shows Labor's primary vote down to 34% and the Greens up to 14%. The Prime Minister says she's not fazed by poll results.
I don't comment on the polls. We obviously, get on with the job of making decisions in the nation's interests on the economy, education, broadband, climate change and obviously today on health.
But Green Senator Christine Milnes says the major parties are losing popularity because it's not clear what they stand for.
Well, the Greens are a very strong progressive force in Australian politics, and the thing that the Greens have going for us is that we are authentic. Our values are there quite clearly to see, and we carry that through into the policy positions we take into the Parliament, through our legislation and the way we vote on a range of issues. The problem for both the major parties at the moment is that they don't really know what they stand for, and so they are mainly driven by focus groups and opinion polls.
Luke, this idea that Doug Cameron has flagged today that Labor MPs could vote against party decisions is a pretty radical one. It completely goes against over 100 years of that party's tradition, doesn't it, of caucus solidarity?
I think Doug Cameron's rather missed the point. The point is not that Labor politicians should be able to go out there and spout off about whatever policy or against whatever leader they feel like. I mean, I think that would only add to the confusion in terms of what does a particular political party stand for. What Doug Cameron's done, though, is really articulate a case for Labor to have a lot more internal democracy. There seems to be a bit of a culture within Labor that the way to get ahead is never to rock the boat, never to say anything controversial, never to put up your own idea or have an argument on the floor of conference anymore, which is a huge difference to, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where there was always a blue within the Labor Party about something. And I think consequentially that can produce, it can produce, in not all cases, but it can produce MPs who don't have the necessary skills to think up policy or argue for it. So I think Doug's kind of identified the problem but come up with the wrong solution. What Labor needs is more internal democracy, not more people sort of spitting out of the tent.
And Gillian, it's a curious time to raise it when you're in minority government too, isn't it?
Well, he was obviously making the point that he didn't feel able to raise this under Kevin Rudd's regime, saying that, everybody lost their voice, particularly in the last few months of the Rudd government. But it does segue neatly with today's poll, probably not telling Labor anything it didn't know, which is that it is hemorrhaging to the left, that when it comes to progressive issues, there's now 14% of voters out there who will pick the Greens over Labor. Issues like same-sex marriage, the environment, some on Afghanistan. Labor has ceded that ground. It's decided it's fighting for the middle ground with the coalition, but at the same time, it's hemorrhaging to the left, and it's got to make a decision. Does it try to incorporate those progressives back into the party? Or does it just cede that ground and essentially say, well, forever and a day, we're going to have to be in some sort of coalition with the Greens to get over the line?
Joe, why do you think Doug Cameron's flagging this idea at this moment?
Well, it's a sore loser. I mean, if his faction was in the ascendant, then he'd be all about, we've got to respect...
But the left have always been losers in the Labor Party, Joe. Why now?
There have been times when the left has been ascendant in the Labor Party, certainly at a state level.
Not for a long time federally.
No, certainly not for a long time federally, and that's a crying shame. It keeps me up at night. the Labor Party does have processes within it for making decisions. If he doesn't like it, he should get outside of the party. I mean, it's a bit rich for somebody who's in the Senate, who has no personal mandate of their own, who hasn't actually done the sort of stump politics that all the MPs in the lower house have done, who is there purely because it was gifted to him by the rest of the party, for him to then turn on the party and say, oh, you don't own me, I think is a bit
He
rich.
is reflecting a debate that's going on in the party, though, which is, during the Howard years, if you wanted to comment on a progressive issue, journalists would, at a de facto level, go to the Greens, knowing that the Labor left wouldn't speak out, or then you had this situation where Liberals could cross the floor and you'd be getting a comment from Judith Troth rather than the Labor left. So they did. They ceded that whole ground on all those issues, because to speak outside caucus, to even speak, not even cross the floor, was a sackable offence from the party.
And Joe, for years the Liberal Party have used this whole caucus solidarity issue to beat the Labor Party over the head and say you're a party that doesn't embrace freedom, you're not allowed to even speak their mind. Do you think the Liberal Party would like that, to be able to keep having that stick to beat the Labor Party over the head with?
Well, I mean, it's a nice thing to have, but I mean, you got to look at Labor's history as being a party which was very anti-establishment when it started, and it was all about having a small number of MPs who stuck together. And while I don't necessarily believe in a lot of things that Labor or the Labor left do, the whole idea is they have to stick together, and that means compromise. And if Doug Cameron isn't willing to be a team player and to compromise on some things, then he should set up his own party.
Luke, I can't imagine this, been getting over the historical issue of changing something that's so to the core of the beliefs of the Labor Party. But the issues that Doug Cameron raised today, surely that would provide, if you started doing it, it would provide the media and the opposition with the ability to say, look, there's disunity in the party. Whenever you hear someone speaking out in the Labor Party, here, they can't stay our message. There's chaos.
Well, I just want to go back a point. You mentioned that the Liberal Party's had a lot of fun at the Labor Party's expense, talking about how you're all supposed to act in solidarity. Well, I didn't notice too much love in the Liberal Party room for people like Petro Georgiou or Judith Troth when they actually spoke their consciences. There might not have been a rule in place, but they certainly weren't garlanded with flowers and roses when they chose to deviate from the party line.
But they weren't expelled from the party, Luke, were they? And that happens in the Labor Party if you do that.
No, you get expelled in the Labor Party if you cross the floor on a vote. But any party which can have both Julia Erwin and Michael Danby in it is a pretty broad church, and there's a pretty broad range of opinions that are, held within the Labor Party. And just to touch on the point about this being the cause of Labor leaking to the Greens, I don't actually think that's true, because I haven't heard too many Greens members argue amongst themselves in public at all. The real issue for the Labor Party is how are we going to strongly and proudly enunciate our agenda and talk about the things that we want to talk about and be proud of our record in government and be proud of our agenda. The big mistake that Rudd made is he ran away from every single reform and every single policy plank he ever had, rather than being willing to fight for them. And I think people see that and they don't think that that's much in the way of leadership.
Luke, in state politics in Victoria, it's a problem too, isn't it? It looks like the Greens could pick up a few inner-city seats in the upcoming state election there.
Well, it's an interesting point that you raise, because while the Greens are predicted by a lot of people to pick up somewhere between 2 and 4 seats in the lower house, to actually do that, the Greens can only get there with Liberal preferences. The Greens have to do a deal with the Liberal Party to get their preferences, to get them over the line ahead of the Labor Party, which then makes me laugh when I hear someone like Christine Milne talk about how the Greens have these unimpeachable values. To me, trading votes with your ideological opposite just to get yourself elected comes across as a bit of a grubby political backroom deal rather than high and mighty principle. So there's a problem there for the Labor Party as well.
Joe, I want to come to you on that.
Is there a problem? People have got to start calling Greens on it.
Joe, is there a problem for the Liberal Party, given that the Liberal Party is bashing up Labor for having a coalition with the Greens in federally, to sending preferences to the Greens' way in estate politics?
It would be a huge mistake. I mean, the reality is that Greens members, at least with the Greens party we have at the moment, are not going to vote with the coalition, and it's only going to tarnish the Liberal Party's brand. So I think for the Liberals to support the Greens just so they can score a few points off Labor is, I think, against what the Liberal Party actually stands for.
Well, there's not quite unity and solidarity across the Liberal Party at the moment either. In his soon-to-be-released memoirs, former Prime Minister John Howard puts the boot into former Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett. for advocating industrial relations reform but going soft on union pickets during the maritime dispute of 1998. But Mr Kennett has struck back with a few criticisms of his own.
I think John's just trying to create a bit of controversy to sell his book. I mean, why would you buy it under normal circumstances? It's part of history. It's one man's opinion. He led a government that did no damage to the country during the best economic times we ever had, but unfortunately he will never earn the title of being a reformist government nor a visionary government. He was a government who occupied the government benches, used the good times to do some interesting things, but could have done so much more had they had a vision and had they had the will.
Gillian, you worked on the Howard Years, the ABC documentary series. What do you make of Jeff Kennett's analysis of the Howard Years?
Jeff Kennett calling John Howard arrogant and accusing him of having a Jesus complex. The words pot, kettle, black sort of come to mind. Look, they go way back, these two. I mean, there was the infamous recorded conversation in the car between Jeff Kennett and Andrew Peacock when the C word was used about John Howard extensively, and Peacock ended up getting the boot when Howard was then opposition leader. Jeff Kennett spoke out against the GST deal that had been done with the Democrats, said it should have been kept in its purest form. So if it was up to Jeff Kennett, there'd be a GST on everything. Why doesn't anyone just say, I don't care what John Howard says in his book, and let it go, instead of lighting the Molotov cocktail and throwing it? Because they're politicians and they love it and they can't help themselves. Pure and simple.
Joe, what did you make of those comments today?
Well, I mean, we have these two great national leaders, these two heroes, I suppose. One of our greatest prime ministers, the other arguably our greatest premier in Australian history. It's a shame to see them scrapping like this. The reality is they face very different circumstances. Kennett was able to get through a lot of very unpopular reforms because he had a crisis to work with. There was a constituency out there to change Victoria, to save Victoria. When you're governing through the best economic times in Australian history, the constituency for wrenching change isn't there. That Howard managed to get any GST at all up to be able to get the workplace reforms, specifically the waterfront resolution, to get all of that sort of thing done was very difficult, and a lesser leader wouldn't have been able to. So credit where it's due, I think.
Luke, what do you make of this spat today between Kennett and Howard?
It's handbags at 20 paces, isn't it? I mean, both of these guys are suffering from an acute case of relevance deficiency syndrome. Paul Keating once said that the country owes former leaders nothing when they depart. He was 100% right.